Hello second years, welcome to your flipped learning video on cultural bias. So this sits at the top of issues and debates. You've done gender bias, and the next thing you're looking at, of course, as I've just said, is cultural bias. So the key terms are universality and bias, and then particularly for cultural bias, ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. After that, we move on to the debates. Is it free will? Is it determinism? Is it nature? Is it nurture? Is it holism? Is it reductionism? Is it ideographic? Is it nomothetic? And then finally, the ethical implications of research, considering socially sensitive research. These are some of the examples of some of the questions that might come up in cultural bias. For example, outline one problem associated with alpha bias in psychological research and one problem with beta bias or beta bias. You need to consider the problems, what's the impact of those things. That one's more for gender. And then here we've got asking about, again, another one about gender. So one that hasn't been asked as much is cultural bias. However, as you see question 3, in a moment you'll see these definitions come up on a later slide, so you can be confident that the definitions link to the mark scheme specifically, or what how AQA have defined them. These are some terms for cultural bias as well, but it is an area that perhaps hasn't been explored as much in issues and debates. However, it is also, whilst any question could be a 16-mark question, it feels harder to present those AO3 points, but it is still possible that it could come up, although generally it feels like they'd be smaller mark questions. But who knows? AQA, as you know, like to surprise us. So, cultural bias, as it says here, is a tendency to judge people in terms of one's own cultural assumptions. So it's the idea that we might look at people and understand them by applying our own cultural assumptions to them, as opposed to considering them within their own culture. And psychology is definitely not innocent of this. So when we think about psychology, a lot of the research and theories conducted are very much focused through a Western gaze, or through a culture that's inspired by European kind of influences. So 64% of psychologists are American, or at least they were in the 90s. Obviously that's changed. I can't find any later figures, so you can consider that, but I'd be amazed if it had changed drastically. So if we're just thinking about within one country, 64% of psychologists are American. Americans dominate psychology, and then the UK and other European countries probably aren't far behind that as well. So the people studying psychology, researching psychology, practicing psychology, so they could be clinical forensic psychologists, are all very much based in the West. There was some analysis done on a social psychology textbook that was found that 94% of the studies in this textbook were based in North America. So again, people studying psychology are being taught studies that are exclusively American, and I'd be amazed if the last 6% weren't also from a Western kind of background or culture. And this textbook wasn't particularly unique. You can confidently generalise the research. Again, this was in the 90s, so there's a little bit of temporal validity there. Hopefully we've moved forward slightly, but still there's a big focus on American and European research. Okay. So just quickly, I'm just going to flick onto this slide. So not only are people reading about research that is mostly American, not only are most psychologists American, but also psychology is most consistently taught and considered to be the best. And obviously there's potentially an element of cultural bias. The universities that meet the criteria set out by a very biased psychology are all in America or the United Kingdom. And this is from the 2009, the best universities. And if you look at the institution where they're all based, it's either the United States or the United Kingdom. Okay, so people are psychologists are mostly exclusively from the West. The studies we look at are exclusively from there, and the way that it is taught, or how people are being taught, is also very much based there as well. Okay, so if we look at some specific ideas of when we're judging people in terms of our own culture, and kind of applying theories and research that really only apply to one culture and blanketly applying them to all. Milgram and Ash are two very famous studies. As well as suffering from gender bias, they also suffer from cultural bias. So Milgram was looking into obedience, and his sample was made up only of American males, and Ash was looking at conformity and again, his sample was only made up of males from America. Killerman Mann did some research in 1974, so they replicated Milgram's research, and they found that people in Australia were the overall conformity rate, and this was broken down between men and women, the overall conformity rate was 28%, which compared to Milgram's 65% is hugely different. So whilst there are studies that have replicated and found Milgram's research in that's similar in other countries, Australia is a country where that obedience is not as strong a reason to follow orders, so people are less likely to obey. So there's some cultural bias within that. There's clearly some cultural variation, and we can't just blanketly apply Milgram's research. Piaget as well claimed that he developed, I think if you can remember the term, universal stages, so stages that everybody from all countries went through, whereas, where is it on my notes? Whereas somebody conducted Dazan in 1994. So if you want to make a note of their name, might not be he, DASEN in 1994 conducted research on Aborigines. So again, people based in Australia, and he found that the ability to conserve came much later in Aboriginal children, between the ages of 10 and 13 rather than the ages of 5 or 7, as suggested by Piaget. So that suggests that Piaget's stages are culturally biased and not universal, because they can't be applied effectively. However, the same psychologist found that spatial awareness developed much earlier amongst Aboriginal children than Swiss children, and that demonstrates that not only is it based on biological maturation, cognitive development, but also on cultural factors too. So of course Aborigines, a lot of their language and the way that they speak is very much based on direction, and a spatial awareness of where they are in a way that maybe it isn't in Swiss and other European cultures. And also things like conservation aren't as important, so those concrete concepts about certain objects aren't as important either. Okay, another theory that you will come across, I've tried to make more theories in research that you have looked at. Another theory is Maslow's hierarchy of need. Now you will look at this in the humanist approach. It'll be one of the last new things you learn in psychology, and this diagram is ever so slightly different, the wording, so don't worry too much, but just to give you a feel. So Maslow's hierarchy of need, and you might have come across this in other subjects, business, media, film maybe, is the idea that people have certain needs which they need to fulfill. If all of those needs are fulfilled, then they can self-actualize, and that means to be the best person they can be, fill their full potential at that time. So there is physiological and safety needs, so your basic needs like hunger, not being hungry, feeling safe, all of those things. Then after that there's the social needs, so belonging, people around you care for you, and then there it says prestige, but we also it's also known as esteem, so you care for yourself. If all of those things are true, then you can self-actualize. So if we applied that to the classroom, it's the idea that if you're not hungry, you'll be able to concentrate better than if you're hungry, so that's a physiological need. If you feel safe, so if there's not a great hole in the floor or the fire in the corner, you can concentrate more on what's being taught. If you feel like the people around you accept you, then you can feel more confident. And if you think maybe about lessons where you've got lots of friends that accept you compared to lessons where maybe you don't, do you feel as comfortable? Self-esteem, so if you feel confident that you could understand the information, self-efficacy, you believe in yourself and have confidence in yourself, then you can self-actualize, you can fully achieve everything, you can understand everything that you're possibly able to in that lesson, and that would be self-actualizing. So that is a piece of research or a theory which Maslow applied to everybody in the world. So again, he claimed it was a universal theory that could be applied to everybody to explain our personal growth and development in the humanist approach. The Western culture, it actually suited a Western culture much better, because a Western culture is what we call an individualistic culture, and that's the idea that the individual is the most important. So striving to be the best that you can be. So an example would be employee of the month. You want, and making and getting a bonus for yourself would be the most important thing in a Western culture. Asian cultures generally, and again, just by talking about breaking this down into individualistic and collectivist, we're being quite culturally biased, because actually there's a lot more variation between people within a culture than there is within cultures itself. But generally speaking, we might argue that the Asian culture is more collectivist, so working as a group. And so if you look on the other side, there is actually an alternative hypothesis or a hierarchy, which Maslow's hierarchy of need does not explain as effectively, or it's been altered. So Maslow did the original one, and someone else has changed this hierarchy of need to fit more comfortably with a collectivist culture. So they're acknowledging we need the same sort of physical needs, so physiological and safety needs, but after that, the type of social needs we have are very different. So it's about affiliation, working together, having admiration from other people, and then status within the group. So, and that's different from self-actualization. So not being you being the best that you can be. Ultimately, collectivist cultures want the group to be the best that they can be. So in a Western culture, they'd want to be employee of the month and get the bonus. In an Eastern or a collectivist culture, it'd be much more about working together most effectively as a group, and everybody getting a bonus would be more important. So that's an example of a culturally biased theory, another culturally biased theory, and it is one that you'll look at in humanist. And of course, you can use it in evaluation point for humanist as well, which is quite handy. Okay, so a lot of the research we've developed, Milgram, Piaget, Maslow's hierarchy, they're research that can't be applied effectively to everybody. So there's a cultural bias. We're looking at behaviour from a very Western perspective and not considering other cultures and the fact they might have different levels of obedience or conformity, different levels of different stages or times or orders of cognitive development, or different needs to be and different ultimate goals as well as in Maslow's hierarchy. Okay, there is a very specific type of cultural bias called ethnocentrism, and that's emphasising the importance of the behaviours of one's own culture. And this comes from cultural bias. So much like androcentrism comes from beta bias, ethnocentrism comes from cultural bias. So considering your own culture to be the most important. And of course, this has a massive impact on other cultures, because other cultures' behaviours are then considered abnormal, so not the norm, and therefore abnormal and different and potentially even clinical, which means they can be considered to be worthy of diagnosis, and that people can be unwell, which is not the case. So it's not acknowledging that cultures are different, but it's saying that one culture is right and one culture is wrong. An example of that is the definitions of abnormality. As you know, the way that we understand or classify behaviours as abnormal or not has a lot of cultural bias around it, and therefore that can lead to a lot of misdiagnosis. So people in black and ethnic minority groups are 7 times more likely to experience or be diagnosed with psychosis. And there are lots and lots of different factors included within that, and I'm sure you can already start to see that, of course, because there is a lot of bias and prejudice in the world against certain ethnic groups, that of course that prejudice and all the impacts on it, such as not being able to being unemployment and poverty, very much could lead to mental health needs. But there's also an element of the fact that there is cultural bias within the way that we define and diagnose mental health, and a lot of behaviours that that we as a Western culture might consider abnormal are actually not abnormal in other cultures. And we've already talked about this, and for example, certain cultures, it's much more normal to hear voices or to hear your ancestors speaking to you and giving you guidance. Because that's not a value in a Western culture, we consider it abnormal and therefore classify it as a mental health need, whereas actually it may just be that different cultures are different and have different understandings. Okay. The strange situation is also an example of ethnocentrism. So, of course, if you think about the terms of it as well, so Ainsworth found that there was secure attachment, or there were 2 types of insecure attachment, and just by the name secure attachment, that sounds much better. She conducted research only on a Western sample, and then applied it to, or an American sample, and then applied it to lots of other cultures. And therefore that can have a negative impact. For example, children should be distressed. According to the strange situation, if they have a secure attachment, they should experience an appropriate amount of distress from being left alone without the, in this case, mother, because the strange situation focused on the mother. And that did not consider other cultures. So German children were much more independent and therefore were not distressed when they were left on their own. So they were classified as insecure avoidant, and therefore if we extend that idea of emphasising the importance of one's own culture and then seeing other cultures as abnormal. So German mothers were seen as cold and rejecting. Now, it's not actually necessarily that they just have a different attachment type and a different way of raising their children compared to other cultures, such as the American culture in the strange situation. So it's the fact that we've applied our lens, our concept of what child raising should be and how children should behave, and therefore we've said that other cultures are wrong or their behaviours are abnormal. And I've just put in Takahashi there because, of course, you'll know more from Andy's topic about German mothers and potentially Japanese mothers as well, and the children that were extremely distressed when left alone. So if we applied we looked at that, we would be applying the idea that they were insecure. Ambivalent might be the term that you've used, and that behaviour is wrong, but actually it's just cultural differences as opposed to being the right way and the wrong way to raise children. And also as well, you've touched on this previously, but IQ and IQ tests very much are a Western method of measurement of IQ, whereas actually intelligence can mean lots of different things to lots of different cultures. So somebody with a high level of intelligence might not achieve as well on an IQ test because it's designed to test Western intelligence, whereas there's lots of variation, and we'll come back to that in the evaluation points as well. So really what we should be aiming for is cultural relativism, and that's the idea of appreciating that cultures vary between, the behaviour varies between cultures. So we understand that behaviours are all relative to the culture that we are observing them in. And Vygotsky, if we're drawing comparisons, so we had Piaget, who said he had universal rigid stages, which was found not to be the case. Vygotsky very much focused on the idea that it was the culture that the child was in and the society they were in that influenced and changed and developed their cognitive development. So Vygotsky appreciated that those behaviours might vary between culture, but so only acknowledge the importance of culture in influencing each one of those behaviours. Okay, so that's the opposite, or the salve for cultural bias, acknowledging that behaviours vary between culture. And if we do that, then hopefully we will develop universal theories and research as well. So universality is the belief that some behaviours are the same for all cultures. And again, we could have the 7 universal facial expressions, because I don't want to teach you another theory, because I know you have lots of information you need to remember. So 7 universal facial expressions. The idea that all humans will respond spontaneously to the stimulus that makes them happy with the same facial expressions, or stimulus with that makes them sad with the same facial expressions if it's spontaneous. So they are all the AO1 terms. Let me just check. Yes. We've talked about all of those. Excellent. So now, just a note in the book, there are some terms, emic etic and imposed etic. You're more than welcome to read up on those, and especially if you're a sociology student, I'd recommend it, because they're terms which overlap with sociology. However, they're not on the specs. I've decided not to include them this year. So you can either do some reading, there is some stuff in the dog book about them, or you can just note that they're not on the spec and leave them blank. Okay, so AO3, the evaluation of cultural bias. So, exactly like gender bias, there is some significant impacts from having a subject or a psychology, a piece of research, a theory that is culturally biased. So the whole of psychology very much views human behaviour through a very Western lens, and that can lead to some significant problems, including very flawed research. So one of the biggest things, if we don't acknowledge that cultural bias exists or is a problem that and we think we are effectively managing culture, then we will have significant problems with sampling issues. So if you are male, American and middle class, you are 4,000 times more likely to be selected for or take part in a piece of psychological research than if you are a different gender, a different culture, or a different class. So that is a significant problem. If we allow cultural bias to continue, then we have some serious sampling issues. People do not challenge and manage those. The same way, as you all know, if we have issues with sampling and we develop theories based on that research, or we test theories using that research. So either we do lots of research and develop a theory, or we develop a theory and then test it, doing lots and lots of research. We will develop very biased and ethnocentric theories which do not effectively explain human behaviour, cannot be universally applied effectively, and cannot be culturally relative as well. So of course so the overall impact that has is it reduces the validity of psychology as a whole. Also, another thing about cultural bias, another impact of it around, if theories are biased and sampling issues aren't addressed, then people from other cultures who could make psychology less biased or support psychology to challenge those biases or point those biases out are going to be put off from studying psychology and or even reading and engaging in psychology. So if elements of bias come through, it's going to make psychology less representative, because it's going to continue putting those people who aren't represented off. Okay. The other thing that cultural bias does within psychology is it reinforces stereotypes. And I'm sure you can think of your own, and if you can back them up with statistics, that is absolutely fine. You can use whatever you want to reinforce different stereotypes of Black and ethnic minority groups. The one that I'm going to focus on is the US Army, and they conducted IQ tests as part of their recruitment for World War I, and they consistently found that people from particularly African backgrounds were consistently getting lower IQ than American soldiers. Rather than looking at the IQ test to see if they could explain it through the IQ tests, what they did instead is draw conclusions that people from African descent were less intelligent than white people. Whereas actually the problem came from the fact that their IQ test lacked validity. It was culturally biased. It was not effectively measuring intelligence. It was measuring a very Western interpretation of intelligence rather than being universal or acknowledging or being culturally relative. So acknowledging that IQ means different things in different cultures. Because of that, a stereotype that developed in America and beyond potentially is the idea that Black people are not very intelligent. Apologies, I had to sneeze and then I paused it and I didn't sneeze, so I might have to pause it again in a minute, but I think I'm okay. So very unfortunate time to want to pause it as well. So that incorrect stereotype that came from poorly conducted psychometric testing developed this stereotype. And we can see that today in the fact that for not only this reason, but for lots of other reasons, one of these is a contributing factor. A lot of people from ethnic minorities are not in employment and they live in poverty, they're not well paid. So an example here would be, there's been a lot of research in the reporting in the media recently that about the top universities barely accepting anybody from an ethnic minority background at all. And also there's research recently in 2018 has found there is a 17% pay difference in white and Black graduates from a university. So those people have exactly the same qualification to exactly the same standard. It controlled for factors such as the type of work, personal characteristics, and background. So these people were people working in the same type of work, so the same sort of job. They had the same personalities, they came from the same sort of class and same backgrounds, and yet there was still a 17% pay difference. So potentially you could argue that an element of that might be because, along with many other things, that other elements of the stereotype, one of the stereotypes that Black people are not as intelligent as white people, could have influenced the way that people recruited and hired employees. So that is a huge problem. And then if we link that back to psychology, again, we're quite clearly, if we're putting forward research that supports this idea of stereotyping, we're going to put off those people who are being stereotyped by us, therefore maintaining psychology's very biased approach, because we're not representative of lots of different cultures and genders and lots of other things as well. Also, it again reduces the validity of psychology because we've got very biased, in this case, methods of measurement and also public relations. People aren't going to want to engage with or trust psychologists if they can see there's lots of cultural bias and we are supporting essentially racist behaviours. As well as the impact of cultural bias, on a slightly more positive note, we can work hard to reduce cultural bias. So if we acknowledge that cultural bias exists, then we can work hard to reduce it, and there are things in place to start doing that. For example, Indigenous psychology. So this is a psychology much like feminist psychology, which is specifically focused on developing representative psychological research and theories and challenging those which lack which are not representative. So existing theories and research that is not representative. And they advocate for the idea that we should study people in their natural contexts as well. So the idea that researchers should seek out people in their natural cultures and environments and people from all cultures. There's also the idea of Ethnocentrism. So this is the idea that acknowledging that from an evolutionary perspective, a lot of Black people's, or the argument from Afrocentrism is that all Black people's roots they've all evolved from Africa, and therefore we should very much view and develop theories and research that acknowledges that is where the culture that they came from, or where they evolved from, and we should acknowledge that and put that view on their behaviours. So a different view to ethnocentrism or a European view, because then their ultimate roots are not in a European geographical location. Okay, and then there is by reducing cultural bias, by challenging cultural bias, we can develop better research. And that's not only better research for culture, so more representative culture, but if we start to work on improving, acknowledging and improving cultural bias, then we're probably going to automatically start to manage other biases better, such as managing that sampling issue that if you're white, middle class, American, you're 4,000 times more likely to be in research. So not only is it challenging culture, but other gender bias, class bias, lots of other things as well. So reducing cultural bias can give us much more valid research, and therefore all of that research will develop that more valid theories, or that valid research will more effectively challenge and develop existing theories as well. So an example of a piece of very effective research that it works as hard as it can to minimise cultural bias was Buss. So Buss looked at this idea that we've already touched on last week, from the idea that men seek out short-term relationships and women seek out long-term relationships. So he was working hard to try and develop an appropriate, non-culturally biased, so a universal theory of mating preferences, and consistently found that men preferred younger women and women preferred older men. So younger women can remain fertile for longer, so men can pass on their DNA for much longer, whereas women seek out older men because they have more resources. So in the modern, whilst this is based on evolution, in the modern world, obviously if somebody's been in work for longer, they've been able to develop more experience, have a higher paid job, already own a house, already own a car, different things. The way that Buss did this is he visited 36, 36 different cultures, and he had and interviewed different people about their mating preferences. So do you prefer, I describe your ideal mate, do you like this, do you like this? He had 3 translators involved, and not 3 that just followed him around, 3 that were native to every culture that he visited. So one translator would translate the questionnaire from English into the native language. Another person would then, another translator would then translate it back from the language that they were working in back into English, and a third translator was there to pick up any discrepancies or issues. So there was one translator, and this was for both the questionnaires and for the answers, were translating them from one language into another, and the other translator was translating them back from that language into another language. So if it's a questionnaire from English to the language, and then the answer from the language into the English language, which is where the research that Buss was the language that Buss was working in, and then that third translator to manage any discrepancies, errors, or issues as well. So he was working hard to try and manage some of that cultural bias, working with people who were native to the country, and had several different people checking and considering translations, which are very much based in cultural variation and cultural difference as well. Because of that, much more valid piece of research, therefore developing a much more valid and universal theory, which is good for psychology, because we're getting much more accurate theories that can explain everybody's behaviour. So that is cultural bias. Next week, we shall be looking at free will and determinism.